Okay, so happy Friday, guys. This is your last lecture for the week, and I can't be there, so we're doing it this way today. If this goes well, we might do it like this more in the future, but it depends how good your guys' notes are, because you can barely take notes when I'm there, so I don't trust you guys to take them while I'm gone. Today, we're going to mostly talk about Thomas Jefferson and this idea called Jeffersonian democracy, and then we're going to cover a little bit of starting the United States arc of becoming a world class nation, like I talked about on Wednesday, which is today when I'm recording this. But you guys are watching it on Friday. So, first, we're going to kind of just do like an intro to Thomas Jefferson. If you guys remember from the Wednesday lecture, he was Secretary of State in Washington's cabinet. The problem with being under Washington's cabinet is, as I mentioned, there are these two kind of factions in Washington's cabinet. There's the Hamilton faction with the Federalists, and then there's the Jefferson faction with the Democratic Republicans. Washington, on paper, was an independent. In reality, he much more closely allied himself with the Federalists and Hamilton's vision for the United States, which caused Jefferson to resign as Secretary of State, I believe 2 or 3 years into Washington's administration. So Hamilton stuck around a little bit longer than he did, but after George Washington stepped down under 2 terms and it was clear that he was not going to run for president again, then Thomas Jefferson declared candidacy for president, and there were a few other candidates as well, but really what it became down to is it was Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams, who was the vice president in Washington's cabinet. That was 4 years before the election of 1800, when Thomas Jefferson and John Adams ran for president against one another, and Adams ended up winning that election. However, just going through it briefly, Adams was not a terribly effective president. He passed some laws that a lot of people thought were a little bit too dictatorial, especially after Washington set the precedent, of what a president should be. So, in the election of 1800, it was a complete rematch from 4 years earlier. You had Jefferson, who was the Democratic Republican, and then you had Adams, who was the Federalist, and Adams was trying to win himself a second term, right? Washington set the precedent that presidents should only serve for 2 terms. As I mentioned, because Adams was not a super effective leader, Jefferson ended up winning that election in an incredibly close and contentious race, right? I mentioned that in this election on Wednesday, there were some horrible things said about each other. You know, Jefferson published in his newspaper that Adams died. There was all kinds of crazy political shenanigans happening during this election. But Jefferson ended up winning. And the election of 1800 is really important in early American history because it continues what Washington did, which was the peaceful transition of power, right? Under a monarchy, power is assumed when the current monarch dies, and then the new king or queen kind of assumes the government, right? Under this republican system that the colonists made under the Constitution, power had to be peacefully transferred, right? And this was the first election after Washington that it wasn't really clear if power was going to be peacefully transferred, right? One of my friends walked by, I was waving hi at her. But in this system, you have Adams and Jefferson, who both bitterly and contestedly wanted the White House, but Adams, as the incumbent president, said, I'm going to let Jefferson become president, right? That was a pretty important thing. We take it for granted today that peaceful transition of power. I know peaceful transition of power, election of 1800, kind of building off the Republican system. It's also important, sometimes you'll see the election of 1800 be referred to as the revolution of 1800. This is not like a fighting revolution like what we talked about during the American Revolutionary War. This is just the same. This refers to the same thing as that peaceful transition of power, right? It's the same concept. Some people like different terms. I go back and forth, but those mean the same thing. And it's really critically important. We cannot stress enough how important it is that power was peacefully transitioned from one party to the next. Because not only were Adams and Jefferson different presidents, but they were from different political parties, right? John Adams was a Federalist. He was the only Federalist president. And then Thomas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. And it showed this new nation that was still horribly in debt, still horribly poor, did not have a strong military. It showed the world that their Republican system and their democratic system of government could actually stand regulating itself and regulating its elections and its processes as outlined in the Constitution. So the year is 1801. Jefferson is president, and he's going to win a second term, so he's going to serve until 1809, right? That's the term length of Jefferson, served 2 terms, because Washington set that precedent that presidents should only serve 2 terms. Even though that the constitutional amendment was not yet ratified, that prohibited that legally. Jefferson comes out, powerful, and enacts this thing which you guys have probably heard of called the Louisiana Purchase, right? And it's really kind of easy to forget today how important the Louisiana Purchase was. It doubled the size of the United States. The United States was now twice as big overnight, right? Originally, Thomas Jefferson sent his Secretary of State, because remember the Secretary of States are the people in the cabinet who are in charge of foreign relations. Jefferson sent his Secretary of State, James Monroe, who would become a future president, to France to negotiate with Napoleon. And he says, Napoleon, we just want the port of New Orleans. We just want that city. And Napoleon said, how about we give you the entire Louisiana Purchase, which comprised about a third of North America, or at least the American portion of North America at the point. And James Monroe was like, yeah, sounds like a plan. So they bought the Louisiana Purchase. It's like it was like for like 3 cents an acre. It was a crazy good deal, absolutely insane. And it doubled the United States overnight. One theme that's going to come out throughout this lecture is Jefferson is a complicated historical figure, right? He has these ideas of how he says things should be philosophically and how he wants to govern, and then he has ideas of how he actually does govern, right? As we learned about on Wednesday, between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, the Democratic Republicans were the ones who wanted the smaller government, right? But then Jefferson goes around and doubles the size of the United States overnight with the Louisiana Purchase. It's an example of this concept called Jeffersonian hypocrisy, which isn't a super firm Jeffersonian hypocrisy. It's not like a super firm historical term. It's just a kind of an easy way to understand this. I like using it because, as you guys will learn throughout this lecture, there's always the idea of how Jefferson says a government should be ran and then how he actually runs the government. Big difference. But the Louisiana Purchase, massive deal for the early United States, doubled its territory overnight. If you guys look on slide number 5 of this lecture, that white blob is all of the land that was gained in the Louisiana Purchase. Everything east of that was pretty much controlled by the United States at the time. There's a few small exceptions. And then everything west of that hadn't yet been controlled by the United States. But all of that white was gained in the Louisiana Purchase. So about a third of the mainland United States today. Massive, massive land purchase for the young nation. Next thing we're going to talk about on slide 6 is you have these people called Lewis and Clark. And I'm sure you guys have heard of them before. If you haven't, it's no big deal. But Lewis and Clark are kind of, today they're remembered as kind of famous folk heroes in the United States, traveling west across the United States. The easiest way to explain the point of Lewis and Clark is that the United States bought the Louisiana Purchase and they knew of the land west of that, but modern maps were not yet implemented, so they literally didn't know what that land looked like. So Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark to explore the Louisiana Purchase and then go west into territory controlled by Mexico and Great Britain to try to figure out what that landscape looked like, because the United States already controlled the Louisiana Purchase, and then they planned on controlling even more land after that. Lewis and Clark, the expedition was from 1804 to 1806, and they were kind of famously guided by the Native American Sacagawea. She showed them what the landscape was, interacted with other Native American groups, and kind of helped them along the way. The real kind of crux of their mission, what they were looking for, is they were looking for a waterway that connected the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean. No such waterway existed, right? But they didn't know that at the time, so they were trying to find a river that, waterway, river, same thing. They were trying to find a river that connected the Mississippi to the Pacific Ocean. And even though that river didn't exist, it was still a valuable exploration because they learned that the river did not exist. They just needed to know whether there was or wasn't one, and even though it was determined that there wasn't one, it was still valuable. And this all relates to Thomas Jefferson because Jefferson was the one who kind of chartered and commissioned their expedition while he was president. So those are two pretty big things that Jefferson did. Generally positive marks on the United States, the Lewis and Clark expedition and the Louisiana Purchase. One thing that he did not do well, people hated this. It was bad, was the Embargo Act of 1807, is that right? Yeah, 1807. This was not good whatsoever. People hated the Embargo Act of 1807. At the time, this was by far Jefferson's biggest failure as president. Essentially what it did is it stopped the United States' official capacity to trade with all foreign countries, right? So you couldn't trade with France or Britain or Spain or Portugal or the Netherlands or Mexico or anyone. Everything had to be made in the United States. And generally speaking, it gets a little complicated when you get into economic theory, but trade makes things cheaper and more accessible. So when Jefferson said that, you can't trade with anyone else, everything has to be made in the United States, that raised prices on pretty much everything, and it made a lot of people really not happy. The idea behind it was that 1807, what's happening in Europe at the time? Napoleon is doing his Napoleon thing, conquering all of Europe. Great Britain's forming an alliance to take down Napoleon and bring stability to the continent, right? Washington said in his farewell address, which was the important document, as you guys learned on Wednesday, that the United States should not intervene in foreign affairs if you can absolutely avoid it, right? So it's Jefferson's idea what the Embargo Act is because trade is a very political thing. He said, I'm going to ban trade with France, and I'm going to ban trade with Great Britain to not choose a side, and he's also going to ban trade with literally everyone else. So the Embargo Act ended up getting repealed because it was by far the most unpopular thing Thomas Jefferson ever did. But the damage had already been done. It was unpopular when it was implemented, and it was not good whatsoever. Moving more into the kind of theory behind Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson is what's known as a strict constitutionalist. Right? What does that mean? It means that the government should only be able to do things that are explicitly set in the Constitution. Strict, firm constitutionalist regarding to the Constitution. That was, generally speaking, the Democratic Republican viewpoint. Federalists were kind of on the opposite. They said, well, if the Constitution says that we can't not do something, then we can, right? It's just a different philosophy for governing, right? Thomas Jefferson, on paper, was a strict constitutionalist. However, the problem with that is that when he governed, he was anything but a strict constitutionalist. He bought the Louisiana Purchase from France, even though that the Constitution says nothing about the president being able to buy territory from another country, right? He said he was against a standing army and navy, which just means a military that is around during peacetime, just to hang out. He said he was against that in all of his writings, but then he goes and establishes West Point, which trained officers for the United States Army permanently, even during peacetime. So we think about Jefferson like this, and this is really ties back to what I said, Jeffersonian hypocrisy. Thomas Jefferson, the philosopher and the writer and the thinker, was pivotally different than the Thomas Jefferson who governed and was president and actually making laws. Very different ideas, and it's just a matter of which one you more agree with. But there's no proper historical analysis of Thomas Jefferson as a figure that skips past this hypocrisy, because he was a very hypocritical person. He did things that he didn't say he should do, and he said things that he didn't. He said he should do things that he didn't do. Right. Touch more on that a little bit towards the end of the lecture. Oh, we're only 16 minutes in. Yeah, this will be a nice and short lecture for you guys. Should be pretty easy. With the Louisiana Purchase, we talked kind of mostly about this in Unit 1 when we were talking about the French and Indian War and those sorts of early North American conflicts. You can't ignore the impact that all of this has on Native Americans, right? When Thomas Jefferson buys the Louisiana Purchase from France and gets that third of the North American plateau, that's all occupied already by Native Americans, right? The problem with that is that the Americans, and to be fair, other European empires as well, but the United States controlled it at the time, they wanted to settle that land, even though that the Native Americans were already there. So just keep that in the back of your mind for now. That's going to be very important in Unit 4, next unit, but it starts right here. It really starts with Columbus, but the American side of it starts with the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson generally favored peaceful relations with the United States, or with the between the United States and Native American groups, but if it became between fighting a war with the Native Americans or sacrificing American interest, he would choose to fight a war with the Native American groups. The other thing that we have to talk about when we're talking about Thomas Jefferson is the slavery issue, right? It's an issue. Jefferson is often heralded as this Enlightenment thinker who wrote All Men Are Created Equal and was very progressive in the ideas that he said at the time. That's fantastic. Are all men created equal? Yes. The problem with that is that when Jefferson wrote the phrase, all men are created equal, in the Declaration of Independence, he did not mean all men. First of all, he meant all men, not women weren't included with that. And he pretty much meant all white landowning males. He didn't mean African Americans. He didn't mean a lot of the Europeans. He certainly didn't mean Native Americans. It was, when he says all men are created equal, he means all white American landowning men, right? The other problem with the slavery issue is that Jefferson owned over 300 slaves on his estate in Monticello. That's a lot. Slaves were expensive back then, right? So owning 300 slaves was a very hard thing to do, right? But Jefferson was very wealthy through the tobacco that he sold from his plantation, and he was able to profit off of them. And he was also kind of infamous for treating his slaves poorly. You know, obviously there's no such thing as a good slave owner, but George Washington, for example, owned slaves, and Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, and Thomas Jefferson is remembered much worse for the way he treated his slaves. Washington freed his slaves upon his death. Still not good. You're still enslaving people, but it's more progressive than Thomas Jefferson writing that all men are created equal and then also owning 300 men, right? That doesn't make any sense. You know, probably the darkest chapter in Thomas Jefferson's life is his relation with Sally Hemings. I mentioned when we were talking about the Embargo Act, 1807, I said that was the most negative thing at the time that people regarded it, and that was definitely true. During his presidency and kind of afterwards, the Embargo Act was the thing that people remembered most poorly about him. Modern historians, it's Sally Hemings. Right? Sally Hemings was a enslaved African American girl living on Jefferson's estate who had a child that looked suspiciously like Jefferson, right? And the problem with that is Jefferson denied it till the day he died. He said, that child is not mine. Denied it, right? By the way, Sally Hemings was like 15, right? She was not an adult. Jefferson denied it forever and ever. Modern DNA testing shows that Sally Hemings' child was 100% Thomas Jefferson's. With that, that is not up in the air at all. It was 100% Thomas Jefferson's. So the problem that we're looking at is we go, I talk a lot about when you're measuring historical figures, it's easy to learn about these like great people who did a lot of good. Did Thomas Jefferson do a lot of good? Yeah, he got the Louisiana Purchase. He established West Point, sent Lewis and Clark. But you cannot get past the slavery issue and the Jeffersonian hypocrisy and him writing all men are created equal when he doesn't mean it. That's a problem, right? Unit 4 and really Unit 5 is going to be very centered on slavery. But just a lot of these early American presidents owned slaves. Pretty much all of them. The first 5, you have Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and James Monroe. They all owned slaves. The only exception in the first 5 was John Adams. And that was because he was from northern Massachusetts, where slavery was already outlawed, and he was much more progressive on his stances on slavery. But out of those first 5 presidents, John Adams was from Massachusetts, and the other 4 were from Virginia, which was the most. That state had the most enslaved people out of any state. So, kind of wrapping up here, talking about the growth of the United States. Let's think about that arc that I mentioned on Wednesday. From now until January, we're going to learn about how the United States went from this, small, weak nation to one of the most powerful nations in the world. Really, that starts with the Louisiana Purchase. That's when they double their territory and they get a lot more land. And that's where that starts. And then it's just going to keep going. Jefferson, to his credit, is probably the first president that really pushed the United States into the modern world and really kind of expanded their influence to not just the 13 colonies. You're expanding into the Louisiana territory, right? We'll learn about next unit, James Madison, the president that came after Jefferson, really expanded into the modern world, fighting a war, right? So all of this sets the stage for future American development. And, without a doubt, Jefferson was the start of that future American development. So just some quick things. The vocab, you guys need to know the Revolution of 1800, same thing as the election of 1800. What else do I have on there? Should know the Louisiana Purchase. I don't think I'm spelling Louisiana right, but that's fine. Louisiana Purchase. You should know Lewis and Clark. And what's the last one? The Embargo Act, probably. Yeah, you should know the Embargo Act of 1807, right? Know those 4 terms. That's your vocabulary spotlight. You guys should do the discussion questions at the end. There's 5 of them. Just make sure you know all the answers to them. I encourage you to do them in a group like how we've been doing them. Looks like we're going to end at about 25 minutes. Perfect. You guys have the rest of the class period to work on any missing assignments you have. Make sure you're all caught up in your notes. If you have any questions on this lecture, you can email me. I'll check my email throughout the day. Or you can ask me on Tuesday because I'm going to be gone Monday as well. So that's all I have for you guys. Thank you for not talking while I'm talking and listening to the Jeffersonian Democracy lecture. Like I said, any questions, email me, or you can ask me on Tuesday. See you guys.